This is my sociological film review of Swept Away. Swept Away by an Unusual Destiny in the Blue Sea of August. An unusual film title for an unusual film. Uh, this film does have a standard three-act structure. In the first act, Act 1, we set the stage for a romantic comedy. We've got a beautiful Mediterranean ocean, a luxury yacht, sunsets, beaches, sexy bossa nova jazz music on the score, gorgeous soft focus cinematography, and the most important element of a romantic comedy, a man and a woman who at first do not seem at all compatible. In the first act, the film sets up a sort of a cartoonish opposition between social classes. At the end of Act 1, the two characters, Raffaella and Gennarino, are swept away, as in the title, and they are stranded on a beautiful desert island. So Act 1 is the standard first act for a romantic comedy. The two leads hate each other, but an audience that is familiar with the conventions of romantic comedy expects them to fall in love eventually. The social class elements of the movie throughout the first act are simplistic, cartoonish, not fully developed. It is only in Act 2 that the film gets serious. At the start of Act 2, the two leads are stranded on the island. At first, Raffaella continues to treat Gennarino as a servant, and she continues to abuse him verbally and expects him to serve her. But he fights back, and due to his superior survival skills, he gets the upper hand. We can read Gennarino's rebellion against Raffaella's assertion of authority as being symbolic of a workers' revolution. Karl Marx predicted that the workers would throw off their shackles, rise up in a revolution against the capitalist class, and eventually create a socialist state that would evolve into a utopian social order that Marx called communism, with everybody working together harmoniously for the benefit of the community. In this film, it's made obvious in the first act that Gennarino symbolizes labor, the working class, and he is rebelling against capital, which is symbolized by Raffaella. And at first, the audience is on Gennarino's side because Raffaella has been so abusive to him that she seems to have it coming. So long as Gennarino is making Raffaella work for her food, we, the audience, are siding with Gennarino. But then the film takes a sharp turn. Gennarino becomes more and more abusive to Raffaella. Eventually, he beats her and he abuses her sexually. As Gennarino works himself up to the quasi-rape by beating Raffaella, he tells her that he is paying her back for all of the abuses of capitalism. And every time he strikes her, he names one of those abuses of capitalists against the working class. The scene culminates with Gennarino almost raping Raffaella, but at the last minute he decides that he wants her to voluntarily submit to him and to love him, and he decides not to go through with the rape. So this portrayal of sexual violence is brutal and disturbing. I want to suggest that the shocking effect of this scene is due not only to its violent nature, but also due to the fact that it upsets the conventions of romantic comedy. In the standard romantic comedy, we expect the leads to dislike each other at first, to fall in love in the second act, to get separated at the end of the second act by some misunderstanding, and then eventually to reconcile and to live together happily ever after at the end of the third act. What we don't expect is for the leading man to beat up and almost rape the leading lady. When Gennarino sexually violates Raffaella, he is also violating the audience's expectations of what is supposed to happen in a romantic comedy, making the assault all the more shocking. And this scene is where the movie loses a lot of viewers. Some viewers get very angry with the movie at this point. Some people check out and refuse to engage with the film at all from this point forward. I first watched this movie when I was in college with my girlfriend, who was a women's studies major, and she was excited to watch a film by a woman director who was known to be a feminist. But she left the room after this scene, and I watched the rest of the movie by myself. And so if the movie bothered you at this point, you're not alone. A lot of the critics also were unable to keep up with the movie and checked out at this point. Because up to this point, we have invested our time in watching a goofy Italian romantic comedy, and now all of a sudden, without warning, the movie has turned into something else altogether. Even worse, now the movie is asking us to think about difficult questions, and it's demanding that the audience try to reconcile opposing viewpoints on both class politics and gender politics. Because now gender politics are being layered on top of the class politics that were laid out so simplistically in the first act. Gennarino is coercing Raffaella into submission. In order to get food and sex, Raffaella must enslave herself to Gennarino as her master. Gennarino kills a rabbit, and Raffaella is horrified. She sees the rabbit's fate, being killed and skewered by a brutal man, as symbolic of what has happened to her on this island. In the first act, there was some foreshadowing of the political layer of this. When Raffaella was ranting on the yacht about communists, she predicted that if the Communist Party ever were to take power in Italy, that they would rule in a brutal and ineffective fashion. Now that Gennarino has achieved his workers' rebellion on this desert island, Raffaella's prediction has come true. The revolution did not result in a utopia, but rather in continued abuse and exploitation, only now with the roles reversed. The rough sex symbolizes how both the capitalist class treats the working class, and how the working class would treat the capitalist class in return if it ever got the chance. Eventually, Raffaella submits to Gennarino, and now the film returns to the groove of a romance. The last part of the second act portrays the two of them as being in love. They are like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden on this beautiful island. Raffaella revels in being Gennarino's love slave. When the rescue boats appear, Raffaella wants to hide because she wants to stay in this idyllic situation. She appears to genuinely love Gennarino, and she appears to have embraced her subjugation to him. And the film portrays this master-slave relationship as sexy and idyllic in this part of the second act. So the movie is forcing the viewer to deal with difficult questions by the technique of juxtaposing two contradictory perspectives. So from the feminist perspective, the film is suggesting that male domination of women is founded in violence and coercion. But it's also giving this is the perspective of the sexual assault scene. But in the second half of the second act, where the two characters are in love, now we turn to a completely different perspective. The film is now suggesting that male domination of women is perhaps the natural order of things in the Garden of Eden, and it may even be sexy and fulfilling for both parties. So these are two completely opposed viewpoints on what is going on the island, and the film is not taking a side. It's portraying both things as being true simultaneously, and it's forcing you, the viewer, to confront that. You can see on my screen that I've labeled this second perspective the religion world history perspective. I call it the world history perspective in the sense that most human societies in world history have featured some level of patriarchy, some level of male domination of women. I call it the religion perspective because most of the large world religions teach that male domination of women is part of the natural order, and this is essentially almost encouraged or demanded by the religion. We can also look at the same issue from the political perspective, the social class, the perspective of class politics. First, with Gennarino's assault on Raffaella, it's suggesting that a workers' revolution might result in a new regime that is just as corrupt, violent, and unjust as capitalism. However, the second half of the second act, where the two characters that are now in love and living happily with one another, suggests that perhaps a workers' revolution could lead to a utopian society in which people are fulfilled by living in harmony with nature and with one another. So which side is the film coming down on? Neither one. It's suggesting that perhaps both are true. It's demanding that you, the viewer, confront these two opposing perspectives. So where the film's politics were cartoonish and simplistic in the first act, now things have gotten very complicated. The film acknowledges that a workers' rebellion can result in brutality. The film acknowledges that male dominance of women can be founded in coercion and violence. And yet, at the same time, the film portrays the workers' rebellion as achieving a utopian situation once the two parties get accommodated to each other. From the gender politics perspective, the film shows a male-female master-slave relationship as sexy and romantic. The film is demanding that you view the situation from multiple perspectives and to acknowledge that human social life is messy and complex, and that two seemingly opposite things can both be true at the same time. The film does not take a hard position on either side. Instead, it forces you, the viewer, to see the complexity. Is male domination of women brutal and violent, or is it sexy and romantic and natural? The film suggests that it can be both. Is the utopian notion of a worker's paradise possible, or would it just result in more violence? The film suggests that maybe both could be true. These are macro-sociological questions, but the film deals with these in the context of an intimate dyad of two people, and so the symbolic interactionist perspective on social class is also relevant here. For example, a key scene in the second act is when Raffaella and Gennarino are making love, and she asks him to sodomize her. He does not know what the word sodomize means. Once he understands her request, he asks her why she can't use simpler language for something so basic. She is uncomfortable with the language that he would prefer to use. So this scene accomplishes a number of things. First, it shows that Raffaella is embracing the relationship and not simply going along with it to get food. She really is in love, and she is voluntarily submitting even more than Gennarino has asked her to. Second, the disagreement over what to call the sex act reveals remaining class differences between the two characters. She views his language as rude and uncouth. He views her language as snooty. In this moment, when the two lovers are at the peak of their intimacy, social class differences are coming between them, even on the desert island. So in this scene, the seeds of the third act are being planted. We see the social class differences that will eventually keep the two lovers apart at the end of the film. Gennarino's need to test the purity of the relationship is what drives him to contact the passing yacht and to get rescued at the end of the second act. He needs to know if the relationship is pure enough to survive back in the real world. Gennarino's concern with purity is also a political parable. Many social movement organizations fall prey to obsession with ideological purity. Members of the group begin competing with one another within their own group to see who can express the group's values in the most extreme way and to see who can condemn the group's opponents in the most extreme way. Often members of the social movement organizations will begin to turn inward on each other and to accuse one another of not being sufficiently extreme or sufficiently loyal or not being ideologically pure enough. This infighting leads to dysfunction in the group and often failure. This is why so many new political movements fail to get off the ground. We see it over and over again as new political groupings emerge. Gennarino has achieved his workers' revolution and seized power. He has dominated Raffaella and made her his love slave. He has everything he wanted, but he is insecure as to the purity of his accomplishment. He needs to take the relationship back to the real world to see if it is pure enough to survive. Gennarino's purity test leads us into the third act, after the castaways are rescued. Once back in society, Gennarino is no longer the dominant alpha male that he was on the island, but instead he is once again a working-class servant. While Raffaella still loves him, she does not know how to make a cross-class relationship work in her world. Gennarino sends her the gift of a ring. The ring is gaudy and ugly and completely inappropriate, not the kind of jewelry that an upper-class woman would wear. Here again, social class, as viewed from the symbolic interactionist perspective, is represented by the ring's different meanings for Gennarino and Raffaella. Gennarino's choice of a ring symbolizes the irreconcilable class differences between the two of them, and Rafaela disappears back into her old world. This is the last that we see of her in the movie. Gennarino gets into a fight with his wife over the affair. He hits her, and she hits him back just as hard. They seem to be evenly matched physically. He cannot physically dominate her. Eventually he submits, and the film ends with Gennarino carrying his wife's suitcase and walking behind her down the pier, suggesting that his dominant male role has ended even within his own marriage. So this is a film that starts as a romantic comedy that uses a cartoonish representation of class warfare as a plot driver in the first act. But in the second act, once the gender politics get overlaid onto the class politics, the film gets very complex and ambiguous and resists simplistic conclusions about who's right and wrong and whose position is most moral. This movie violates your assumptions of how a romantic comedy is supposed to go. It forces you to think about difficult questions. In the 1940s film Sullivan's Travels, the director decides that it is better to make simple cartoonish movies that make people laugh, and that simple entertainment is better than making movies that address the human condition and that make you think. Which side do you come down on? Simple entertainment or movies that make you think? Do you want simple entertainment or do you want art that makes you work for enlightenment? Perhaps this is the main question that Lina Wertmuller is forcing you to confront in Swept Away.